We happened to be the fortunate one to come in a train that had a window. We could see outside. And my aunt recognizes that this is not a good place. She said, I have a piece of chocolate, we have to eat it now. And she broke off a little piece of chocolate and we ate it. She recognized if we don't eat it now, it's too late. And I was wondering then how often people stopping there just took out some food because they were so afraid of the future for good reason. For good reason.
We're going to the Auschwitz-Birkenau. It's January 28th. Yesterday was the day of the liberation, 75 years ago. I was in Auschwitz originally, and all the evil, all the torment happened to me at that point. And it practically never left my life, never left my thoughts. Transport toward Auschwitz gave me sleepless nights for years and years, to a point that I needed professional help. I had learned from an earlier experience when I took my family to Mauthausen, the concentration camp in Austria where I was liberated, and once I faced it, that my nightmares had diminished about Mauthausen. It sort of put a little like closure, and it became less fearful once I had been there. I wanted the same thing to Auschwitz.
The minute that the train stopped, it was total chaos. Total chaos. The yelling, the screaming, the dogs, raus, 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 yelling, screaming. And you leave everything on the train. Everything. They tell you to divide. Men and women divide right then and there. And it's more tense than what you have right now, dispersed already here. Close together. Kids and everything. Families are separated right there. And you don't have any big scenes there. You say goodbye or anything like this. Forget that. You separate, move, move. Here starts where you lose your identity. You go in and you get undressed. Well, I'm 15 years old. I've never undressed in front of a man. So now I have to get totally undressed. And the SS is all over the place. And sneering. So the next stop, I can't believe it. They're shaving our hair. We no longer had anything that belonged to us. Sing The purpose of Auschwitz was the holding place to send people to a slaughterhouse. There were 474 Jewish people in the beginning. 7 people survived. The 7 people were all women, and I am the only school child that survived. None of the boys, none of the men returned to Bonn. Speak of guilt on my part. Our rail car approached the entrance. Men in uniform were working along these tracks. My aunt seemed to realize our destination and predicament, and with urgency told us that she had a very small piece of chocolate, and with her saying, "Let us eat it now, let us share it, share it." She took it out and she gave a piece of chocolate to each one of us. Why don't you do that? Take a piece of chocolate and hold it. This was our last thing, to eat something togetherness. It was our very, very last sweet thing that we could share, because before the next hour was up, she was gone for us forever. We are going to eat this chocolate right now. We want to think of her and the many other people who probably realized this might be the very last they can do for whoever is with them. All I remember is the chocolate and her face right here in horror that she had to walk over there. Nobody should ever part like this. Nobody.
She has made it a life mission to make sure that her story and her family's story is heard and not forgotten. And she does that by speaking to thousands and thousands of kids. And by speaking to them, she's a real human, and she's putting her face on the story to make it memorable for them.
It has to be told. I mean, this is history. We don't want generations to read about this and say, oh, this never happened.
They have to know the history. They have to learn from it. They have to use this as an example. If they don't know what is right or wrong, they will go the wrong way. And that's not what we want. We want them to be good citizens. I've made a promise. I will speak in memory of my parents as long as I can, as long as I'm able to. When I started to speak, I felt this is the right way to go. I can do something positive with all the losses that I personally had, that my people had, and my community had. I feel terrible about that, having lost so many people. When my time comes and I close my eyes, I want to be able to think, I did the best I could. It was probably not enough. Nobody does anything enough. But I think I tried. I did what I could.
Chag Sameach and Good Yontif. We, my wife Jan, my daughters Maya and Hannah, and I want to thank you for allowing us to speak about the trip our family took to Krakow, Poland with my mother Annalisa Nussbaum to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. As many of you know, our family, along with my nephew Idan, were accompanied to Poland by a reporter and a videographer from the Philadelphia Inquirer. Jason Nark wrote a poignant piece in the paper that appeared just after our return. Lauren Schneiderman shot and produced the video that you just watched. And this past week, we were thrilled when it won an Emmy in the Mid-Atlantic Regional Awards. I would like to start off with a brief bio of my mom. Anneliese Winterberg Nussbaum was born in Guben, Germany in 1929. Her family moved to Bonn, Germany when she was 2 years old. By 1935, she became aware of her Jewishness when her family's citizenship was revoked and gradually conditions worsened for the Jews under Nazi rule. On November 9th and 10th of 1938, Kristallnacht, the Nazis burned her synagogue. This was absolutely devastating for her. Being the daughter of the cantor, that synagogue was her second home. In July 1941, when my mother was 12 years old, the Nazis ordered her family and all the Jews of Bonn, a total of 474 people, to move to a cloister. In July 1942, they were deported to Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia. In October 1944, she was deported with her mother and aunt to Auschwitz. Upon arrival, she was selected to work in the slave labor camp. 5 days later, she and her mother were deported to an airplane factory in Freiburg, Germany, where she was forced to make airplane parts. Here, she bartered a piece of bread for a soap dish, a piece of bread for a comb, both of which she continued to show to classes when she lectured. In April 1945, she and her mother were deported in open cattle cars to Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. The trip took 2.5 weeks. On May 5th, the American Army liberated them. My grandmother, afflicted with tuberculosis since Auschwitz, died in December of 1945. In 1946, my mother moved to New York City as an orphan. Her mission was to be on the road of perpetual remembrance. She was a lecturer and had brought her experiences to tens of thousands of school students, as well as many religious institutions, private organizations, and governmental institutions. My mother had previously gone back to visit other camps, including Mauthausen, Dachau, and Theresienstadt. She did return to Auschwitz 4 years ago with my sister and niece, as she was invited as part of a Federation trip. Then, last summer, my mother received an invitation from the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Foundation, ABMF, for the short trip which took place January 26th through 29th of this year, coinciding with the actual date of the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. It took a lot of convincing for her to finally agree to travel to Poland in the middle of winter, and we were so blessed that she finally agreed and will always cherish this trip. The Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Foundation was actively involved in the preparations for the anniversary and in organizing the funding for the participation of survivors and the facilitation of their travel to the ceremony. ABMF believes that the existence of the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial and Museum, its authenticity, and its message will help prevent a reoccurrence of the hatred, racism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia that led to the Holocaust. Their mission is to secure the preservation of the authentic remains of Auschwitz-Birkenau. As the generation of Holocaust eyewitnesses passes away, they are committed to continuing the financial support for the preservation efforts and providing leadership for the site. Ronald Lauder, who is the chairman of the board for the ABMF, said, "Nothing is more important for the upcoming 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz than having survivors of this horrible place present. They are the direct link, the witnesses to this atrocious crime. That is why I am willing to do whatever is needed to bring them back. Let the world see them, let the world hear them, let the world remember. Mr. Lauder felt very strongly that all the survivors be transported back to Poland in a well-deserved, comfortable fashion and generously paid for business class seats for all of them and their companions. You can probably just imagine the logistical nightmare of transporting that many passengers that needed special assistance in wheelchairs. So I, being in the travel industry, was able to arrange for an all business class charter flight to transport close to 1/3 of the survivors directly into Krakow. We were very lucky. Weather cooperated, and remarkably, all the survivors made it on time. Upon our arrival into Krakow, the terminal was filled with local members of the Jewish community who welcomed us in the arrival hall with signs and posters and singing Hebrew songs. The young adults approached each survivor individually, welcoming them and keeping them company until our transport arrived. The woman who greeted my mother actually returned to the airport on the day we left, all on her own, to thank her for coming. It was very touching.
Later that evening, everyone gathered for the opening event dinner, which included speeches from Mr. Lauder, the President of Ukraine, other dignitaries, as well as Holocaust survivors and their families. The presence of these dignitaries and the press from around the globe set the tone for this evening and marked its importance around the world. At the conclusion of the moving and inspiring speeches and dinner, Hatikva was led by an Israeli survivor who was accompanied by 40 of her descendants. Behind them on the screen were images of children in pre-war Poland Jewish schools, also singing Hatikva. We all knew as we sing along that almost every one of those children perished in the camps.
On the morning of January 27th, we traveled to Auschwitz-Birkenau for the 75th anniversary memorial ceremony. This event took place in a huge heated tent set up at the infamous entrance to the Birkenau Gate, which marked the end of the journey for the 1.1 million murdered there. Prior to our arrival at the camp, the 200 survivors boarded buses to meet for a group photo. I was Annalie's official companion and had the privilege to witness this photograph. Seated in front of me were 200 miracles. By design, no one was meant to survive Auschwitz. These remarkable 200 people seated before me each had a story to tell, a story of loss, a story of strength, and of course, a story of survival. Just witnessing it took my breath away. Then we boarded a motor coach clearly labeled as Survivor Delegation that took us to Auschwitz. Upon arriving at the camps, I was overcome with emotions. My first stark realization was one of the enormous size of the place. I was then struck by the fact that there were no walls surrounding either Auschwitz nor Birkenau, just miles of barbed wire fences between sentry posts. And my last quick observation was that the camp was smack in the middle of an ordinary Polish town. To be the people in the houses adjacent to the camp, its sights, its sounds, its smells, must have been horrific. As we entered through the gates, I took Annalie's hand and held it tight. And then I took a moment to glance at the faces of the other survivors on the bus. Some of them looked frightened, some were crying, some looked visibly angry, some triumphant, and I remembered feeling like I had hoped that each of them got the peace they were seeking from this return. As you may have noticed in the invitation shown earlier, the tent was enormous and the stage was positioned facing the well-illuminated Gate of Death, with a wide aisle down the middle of the room to leave room for the railroad tracks, covered in glass and all lit up. Along the inside of the tent, the walls contained movies of barbed wire fences. It was quite a chilling feeling to be seated directly behind the group of survivors who were front and center, facing that gate that brought them years of nightmares. We, the children that accompanied them, willed them all our strength and held up signs that simply read, "We will remember."
Little did I know that this momentous ceremony would change my perspective on life forever. I was talking to my sister about random things, and along with a huge crowd of people, I hurried into the tent. And there it was, the entrance to a place where millions of innocent people were slaughtered. My smile disappeared. I just stared at it for a few minutes before people shoved me to move along. As I just kept walking, I just kept staring at the large railway all lit up. I suddenly got more nervous and jittery. I could feel my eyes swell up, yet I could not take them away from the entryway. I walked up the long pathway to see the tracks. They were covered by glass. I just stood there in absolute shock and horror. I pictured my great-aunt Anita, my great-grandmother, and Grandma on the train. I could see the fear in my great-aunt's eyes. I could see her giving my grandma the final piece of chocolate. I could see all the Jews on their way to misery. As the ceremony began, speakers came up to the podium. I tried my hardest to listen, but all I could hear were the guards yelling, "Rouse, rouse, rouse." The dogs barking, people screaming, trying to hold on to their loved ones. Then all I saw was my great-aunt towards the right side. Then I looked over to where my grandma was sitting on the left. They gave each other the goodbye look, and Anita was gone. I got the chills. As I explained to the reporter, I literally could not even imagine how all these people felt. Never seeing the ones they love again, their moms, dads, siblings, grandparents, ever again because they were Jewish. Being separated from your belongings because they were Jewish. Never getting a chance to live their own and one and only life to the fullest. Why? Because they were Jewish. And it all started with the train tracks just feet away from me. I finally was able to zone back into the ceremony. Ronald Lauder started his speech. He mentioned, "They killed millions of the wrong people. These survivors standing before us are the real heroes." As he spoke in front of the railway, I realized that even though we lost a lot of people, too many people, we still made it. There we were, the Jewish people, standing on the grounds of a plan to kill every Jew possible, with over 200 survivors. Yes, those train tracks will always bring me nightmares, but we made it. And sitting there with all these heroes in the room just proves that Hitler never got the chance to get rid of us. We, the Jewish people, survived.
Speakers during the ceremony included the President of Poland, several survivors, and Ronald Lauder. Cantor David Wishnia from the Philadelphia area, survivor himself, sang the El Male Rahman. The Polish president apologized openly to the Polish survivors, who were each marked with special scarves. One survivor spoke about what he believed should be the 11th commandment. "Thou shalt not be ambivalent," he said, and described his hopes for his granddaughters and future generations, that they not sit idly by as injustice occurs in the world. However, for me, one of the most striking moments during the ceremony took place when Ronald Lauder personally addressed the nearly 100 dignitaries, presidents, princes, prime ministers, ambassadors, and clergy that were present. "Let me be very clear," he said directly to them. "While Germany and Austria caused, created, and carried out this shattering evil, practically every other European country helped the Nazis gather up the Jewish citizens. Too many people in too many countries made Auschwitz happen. When European Jews begged the world for a safe harbor, some place to go, the entire world turned its back on them. Even my own country, the beacon of freedom, turned out its light on the Jewish people when they needed it the most." Then he shockingly looked at and pointed to the government representatives. "Your country did nothing, and your country did nothing, and your country did nothing. We can never let that happen again."
The following day, we went on a tour of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Our group assembled with an expert guide from J-Roots. We began our moving day in Auschwitz. I'm not even sure that my words can even begin to describe how awfully riveted I was the moment we, as a family, all holding each other's hands tightly, walked through the gate that read, "Arbeit macht frei," work sets you free. As I held my grandmother's quaking hand, tears running down her face, I felt triumphant that our family was not wiped out as so many other family lines were. We wheeled my grandmother on the uneven, stony pavement, passing blockade after blockade. Blockade number 10, infamous for the criminal medical experiments carried out by Dr. Karl Klauberg. We walked through an exhibit displaying the thousands of stolen dishes and cups. Our guide shared that while the men packed their tefillin and prayer books, the women made sure they took a meat pot and a dairy pot to cook for their families. They truly had no idea what was coming. There were tens of thousands of pots. Then there were the exhibits of hairbrushes, the shoes, the clothes, the human hair, which was quickly losing its original color and turning ashy gray. Each exhibit represented loss of possessions, the lost identity of millions of people, the lost identity of my grandmother. An exhibit at the Auschwitz Museum that still sticks to me to this day was when my grandmother and I came across the impairment devices. Mumbled words, unclear to interpret, my grandmother broke into tears and said, "This is how my aunt died." My grandmother's aunt, Anita Lewinsky, was my grandmother's second mother. She was a teacher. She was caring, loving, optimistic, afflicted with a leg impairment. Anita was then sent to the gas chambers, never again to be seen. We then found ourselves at the Book of Names, the book that consisted of the millions of names of those who were executed during World War II. My grandmother had just given my cousin, my sister, and I a slip of paper with the names of her loved ones who had perished. As we searched for the names, it was all so real. It took a whole room to list the names of all who have perished. We were then very fortunate to get a behind-the-scenes tour of the conservation lab. The mission of the lab is to preserve all material traces of the camp, including every article of clothing, shoes, documents, and building that remains at the site. The conservators painstakingly work not to repair the artifacts, but to prevent them from further damage. They check every inch of every piece for evidence of threads, hair, or hidden lettering. This lab is mostly funded by fundraising efforts by the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Foundation. Also, several countries have contributed money to this cause, with Germany pledging $66 million to date.
After such an emotional morning, we took a break to clear our thoughts and then boarded a bus to Birkenau. We purposely entered from the rear of the camp, behind the fallen gas chambers, where we were able to view the vastness and enormity of the camp. We began our visit at the Memorial of the Ashes, the grave site of the victims who were brutally gassed. We were fortunate to have in our group Zvi Serber, the director of J-Roots, who have interviewed hundreds of its survivors and was able to put a personal spin on different locations at Auschwitz and Birkenau. As we stood beside the site, looking at hundreds of small yahrzeit candles lining a passageway, he shared with us the story of the underground tunnel that led to the gas chambers and how the victims would patiently and silently wait their turns along this path to strip naked and enter the shower. He told about the horrific job of the Sonderkommando, the Jews whose job it was to extricate the stiff and often intertwined bodies of the dead that were pressed against the door in a huge pile, clearly trying to escape. It was there that we joined together in a mourner's Kaddish for all those that lost their lives on this very hallowed ground, followed by a solemn Hatikvah. We wrapped our arms tightly around my mom, who gave us each a stone she brought back from Israel to place on the wall, the only tombstone of the 1 million+ that lost their lives here. It was here we wept as a family for all the losses that she suffered.
We then began the mile-long walk from the rear of the camp to the entrance. We took turns pushing Annalie across bumpy paved roads that we were told were paved with the ashes from the dead, and across the uneven train tracks passing barrack after barrack in varying states of disrepair. They were unfortunately not open for us to enter, but Annalie stopped us often to tell us about different sections as we passed. We stopped as a group at a fallen building that we were told was a communal latrine. There our guide shared with us how the inmates would work as pairs to lean against each other to use the holes in the bench, so as not to have to sit down and risk getting dysentery. Talked about how infrequently they were allowed to use the latrines, but how soiling themselves greatly reduced their chances for survival, especially in the bitter cold months. With each story, I glanced at Annalie, who would often somberly close her eyes and nod her head in agreement. We eventually reached a crossway. Parked here was a single cattle car. This marked the spot where life or death was determined, where being sent to the right meant hard labor, and being sent to the left meant certain death. At this crossway, Annalie pulled our family aside to speak with us privately. She pulled from her bag a piece of paper and a bag of Lindt chocolates. She read to us the story of her goodbye with her beloved Aunt Anita that you heard about on the video. We ate the chocolates with such sorrow that, frankly, it was hard to even swallow. And after sharing this, she became very quiet. She stopped sharing stories and details and was clearly deep in her own thoughts. I often wonder if she was at that point trying to make her own peace, acknowledging that she would never return here again, but knowing that she had now personally taken each of her children and her 4 grandchildren so that they could one day bring their families to repeat the story and share their own bags of chocolate. Before leaving, our guide asked each of us to pick up a small rock and to put it in our pockets. He told us we should use this rock to keep our own lives in perspective. When we face tough times or sorrow, to find this rock and hold it tightly, and to remember what our families endured here in Auschwitz. We each took a rock home, all of us except for Annalie, who said she didn't need one. She carried the memories with her in a different way.
My grandmother was asked, "What does Auschwitz mean to you?" And she responded with the following: "Very few people can pinpoint the moment when they cease to be a child and become a young adult. It is and should be a very gradual transition. After having to say goodbye to my aunt at the selection process, having to be shaven in front of the sneering SS guards, and seeing the absolutely terrifying look of my mother, bald, dressed in rags, this was my initiation into maturity, and I was never a child again." During pre-Auschwitz times, we lived in constant fear regarding a transport ticket to be sent to another place. What would this mean in terms of treatment? Entering Auschwitz-Birkenau left no doubt we had arrived at a place where evil in its highest form was practiced as never before in history. Auschwitz was a quick taker, as within days and hours it took my father, uncle, my aunt, my people, my clothing, my hair, my dignity, my religious beliefs, my childhood, and much more. Compared to the whole earth, Auschwitz is just a tiny piece of land, but was used to kill 6,000 people a day by a civilized nation. I will look at the ground without understanding, dry tears, and feel sorrow until my dying day. However, I will walk out of Auschwitz with my family as a person who has witnessed a transformation from evil and horror to a place of remembrance and solemnity.
What did I learn from this unforgettable experience? First, I learned not to ever sweat the small things in life, or not to even take a single day for granted. This trip has taught me that hatred of any kind should not be ignored and should never be tolerated. Recently, as part of my high school graduation requirement, I had to participate in a community study project. Prior to the pandemic, I was supposed to present the trip we took to the faculty members of the Upper Dublin School District. Unfortunately, I was unable to do this in person, so instead, I made a virtual presentations sharing the takeaways and experiences previously mentioned to share with the faculty. In it, I shared with them the frightening statistics of how few millennials know anything about the Holocaust or even what Auschwitz is. I urged them to incorporate Holocaust studies into their curriculum more often, in every subject, not just history class, and continue to enforce the idea that hate should never be ignored or tolerated. However, my final and perhaps most important takeaway from the trip was a lesson regarding responsibility. The day has unfortunately come in which my biggest inspiration has passed. It is now my responsibility to share her story, the story of my family, so her legacy will never, ever be forgotten. Hopefully, by me sharing all of the horrific stories I heard, places I saw, and pure sorrow I felt, I will be continuing her legacy. I am a witness to history, and I will ensure that my family will not be forgotten, and this tragic time in history will never be repeated.
As we are speaking to you on Yom Kippur, it is fitting to note this holiday has always been a very difficult date for my mother. As my grandfather was a cantor, he held a makeshift service in Theresienstadt on Yom Kippur in 1944. My mother did not go to his service. It was too painful for her, as she knew that her father would be transported the next day. The transport was to Auschwitz, and she never saw him again. Personally, I cannot express my gratitude enough for this trip. My mother was finally able to take all her grandchildren to Auschwitz. This was also an opportunity for her to go on her last trip and finally get closure in her own way, make peace that she had fulfilled her obligation to tell her story. My takeaway is sad, but all too true reality. In the next 15 to 20 years, there will no longer be any Holocaust survivors alive. Therefore, it is imperative their stories be kept alive and continue to be told. It will be the responsibility of the second and third generations to make sure the Holocaust is never forgotten. After this trip, with a sense of surety and pride, I am now passing on our family's torch to Hannah and Maya to keep history alive. Thank you all again very much for allowing us to share our story with you.